All right, guys, so today we're talking about transmission fluid. This is a very age-old debate, no matter if it's on the Porsche, BMWs, any of the German cars, any of the American cars, any of the Japanese cars. So I would say a lot of cars these days use ZF transmissions. That's a pretty common transmission on most everything. And in particular, a lot of cars use the 8-speed, the new 8-speed version of that. There's been a misconception in past years. It used to be like, let's say back in the 1980s and 90s, you would have a Chevy or a Ford, and if you would change the transmission fluid in it after it had been changed for a while, it would ruin the transmission and it would not back off the lift, right? That's been out of the loop for a very long time. And even the 90s BMWs that had the Euro made GM transmission in them, they aren't like that. It's actually the opposite. So what'll run a transmission the most, whether it's a torque converter transmission, a ZF box, or if it's a dual clutch, or if it's a single clutch SMG, is not changing the fluid. Now on a standard transmission, if you don't change the fluid, what happens? The fluid breaks down, it gets very thin, it also gets very dirty. Either it's going to stop up the transmission filter, starve it from fluid, and it's going to grenade it. And usually an older transmission will break the third gear drum, the D drum, the drive drum. And, so on the general rule of thumb, on mostly everything, if you change the transmission fluid every 40 or 50,000 miles, that's the best practice. You don't have solenoid problems you don't have mechatronic sleeve issues near as often, and you don't have general failures. And let's say you have a car, let's say you have a Tiptronic Porsche like our '06 Cayman, or you have a 911 that has Tiptronic in it, right? So that is a 5 or 6 HP ZF box. And let's say it has 100,000 miles on it, it's starting to shift a little funky, right? So you're going up a hill, it kind of is confused, doesn't know what to do. That's past the time to change it. If it's doing that, I would change it immediately, because we pretty much have a 97, 98% success rate in fixing those gearboxes by changing the fluid. Now, what fluid to use? On those transmissions, I'm not a big fan of the factory ZF fluid on high mileage cars, because the factory ZF fluid is very thin. A lot of the issue, what goes on is you'll change it with the factory fluid, it'll still shift weird. So when you see me use like the Valvoline Max Life, the Trans Max stuff, all these different fluids that are thicker and stinkier, and they're red fluids instead of amber fluids on the color. In my opinion, our findings over the last 20 years of doing this is that has a lot more likelihood of fixing your transmission in a high mileage situation over 100,000 than the factory OEM ZF fluid. It's also cheaper and easier to accommodate. We've never had a transmission failure after we changed the fluid. Now I've changed, I don't even care to admit how many we changed over the last years. Tons and tons and tons. We fixed some transmissions that were in pretty bad shape by doing that. So let's say you have a car that's really it's kicking out of gear, shifting wrong, it's all over the place. If it's that bad, you check the fluid, it's like really dark and nasty. Your best option there is to drain the fluid only to start, refill it with fresh fluid, drive it a little bit, drive it up and down your road, a few miles, it don't have to be real far. At that point in time, we bring it back in, we drain the fluid again, then we take off the pan filter, whether your filter is separate than the pan or it's made in the pan. Then we change the whole filter, then we refill it. Now remember, on most transmissions without a dipstick, you have to do the fill procedure. The fill procedure, whether it's BMW or whatever it is, on a torque converter transmission is you change the filter, change the pan, whatever you have, you refill, you get about 3 quarts, 3.5 quarts in it when the engine's off. once you're full and it's coming out, you start the engine, you keep filling it up, and usually end up about 7 to 8 quarts, depends on what it is. And while it's idling, you tip it off, right? While it's idling, it's also getting up to temperature. What you can never do is start the engine with no transmission fluid in it. That's going to wreck the pump. That's going to cause all kinds of problems. So there is that. Dual clutch, guys, there's actually 2 different parts of that transmission fluid on some of those. We need to do the G-Wagon coming up here. It's got 83K on it, I think. It needs to be done as a preventative. A dual clutch will grenade itself if that pump fluid gets dirty or broken down. Most dual clutches, if changed correctly, the transmission fluid in those, there is a special fluid for those, will last the life of the vehicle, right? It's not a common transmission for failing as long as it's properly maintained. None of these transmissions in any of the cars I've ever serviced or ever worked on is a lifetime fluid. ZF says it's lifetime fluid, but ZF is not in the market to save your transmission. ZF is in the market to sell you a new transmission, right? As often as possible. So we have that. Single clutch cars, SMG, so it's going to be our M5, E60 M5, it's going to be smart cars, things like that. Those have a special fluid, a pump fluid for those also. And there's also things to do when you're driving the car, or not to do when you're driving the car. You can save the transmission. Don't use launch control all the time. You know, don't let the transmission slip like you're going in and out of your garage and you're backing up, off and on the gas, off and on the gas. On the M5 especially, and even our friend's smart car that we had here, it's better to hit the gas, let it engage and go. If you slip the clutch off and on, or if you're pulling it on a trailer, it's easy to smoke the clutch. You can smell it burning. You gotta be aware of that. That's what wears the clutch out so fast. Probably wears it out faster than launch control. On the M5, if you have the shift point set real soft and you're trying to like pull up a little incline in your driveway, that'll burn the clutch immediately. So before we back it out here, usually I click the M button on. It sets the shift points all the way up. So when you hit the gas and it engages all at once and there's no slip to it, right? That's just my thoughts on that. As of right now, what is the best transmission you could get? Like if you're going to buy a car, what do you look for? Obviously, dual clutch is the best because it shifts the fastest. It also shifts the smoothest. But most of the cars you guys are going to be looking at, more than likely, well, it could have PDK. There's a lot of Porsche guys watching this, which is dual clutch. But it's going to be more than likely a Tiptronic transmission. And although they're not bad, everything has to be serviced, guys. The long myth of if you change the transmission fluid, will it make your transmission go out? That all went out with GM 4L60E and 700R4. That is not a current thing. That does not exist in this day and age. Go change the fluid. Go do it correctly. We have videos up at doing that, how to do it right. If you can't find my video, go look it up. Just don't go do whatever you think is right. That will end in disaster more than likely. And if you have a dual clutch or a single clutch SMG, make sure and get the correct fluid for that. It's more like a hydraulic oil at that point. That's going to be it, guys. Thanks for watching the video. Hope this answered a lot of questions. That's going to be all. We'll see you later.